I grew up in a place most people would probably call a mansion, but to me, it was just home. Tucked away in the hills outside Santa Barbara, it stood tall with its warm sandstone walls and endless glass windows that caught the sunrise just right. People said it was worth over $60 million, but for my father, Leo Carter, it wasn't about the money. He was an architect, a dreamer who spent 15 years designing and building that house with his own hands, brick by brick. Every arch, every stone path, every curve of the staircase held a piece of him. My mother, Dana, was the more practical one. She taught finance at a local community college, and even though we could have had anything we wanted, she made sure we understood what it meant to earn something. She wasn't the type to carry flashy handbags or shop for diamonds. Her wealth showed in her sharp mind, the way she balanced accounts in her head, and how she could make complex concepts sound like bedtime stories. If I forgot to track my allowance, she didn't just scold me. She made me do a mini budget presentation before she considered giving me more. One moment I'll never forget happened when I was 9. My older cousin Max had brought over his game console, and in my excitement, I accidentally knocked it off the shelf. It shattered, wires sticking out like roots from a torn tree. He was furious. I cried, of course, but my parents didn't step in with a replacement. Instead, my dad handed me a broom and a screwdriver. "Figure out how to fix it. Or work until you can replace it," he said gently. So I mowed lawns. I swept driveways. I folded laundry for our neighbors, even when they insisted they didn't need help. It took me almost 2 months to save up enough for a refurbished console. And when I gave it to Max, he just stared at me, then smiled. That was the first time I understood what real pride felt like. My parents could have sent me to any fancy private school, but I went to West Valley Public High. They said the real world doesn't come with gated entries and chauffeurs, so I needed to understand it on my terms. I packed my lunches. I rode the bus. No designer bags, no name dropping at school. Just me, my beat-up backpack, and the values my parents etched into my skin like ink. But not everyone saw me the way I saw myself. When I was 13, I made a friend named Haley. She was funny, quick-witted, and always curious about my life. I trusted her. One day, I noticed her game console wasn't working right, and I offered to try fixing it. I didn't know much, but I thought maybe I could help. I opened it up, looked at the wiring, and told her I'd bring it back in a couple of days. The next morning, everything changed. At school, people avoided me. Whispers floated through the halls. Someone had spread a rumor that I'd stolen Haley's console, that I broke it, and tried to lie about it. I tried to explain. I begged Haley to tell the truth, but she just looked at me and said, "I don't know what happened." Those words burned more than anything. I wasn't hurt because they believed I was guilty. I was hurt because someone I cared about chose silence over truth. I returned her console, even left a note apologizing if I'd made a mistake. But I never spoke to her again after that. That week, I sat on the steps of our garden terrace, the sunset splashing red across the sky, and I told my dad everything. He didn't rush to defend me. He didn't offer to call her parents or the school. He just nodded and said, "You now know how lonely it can be to be right." I carried that line with me everywhere from that day forward. That was the first time I learned how people's perceptions can shift like shadows, quick and silent. And that even when you live in a house worth more than some entire neighborhoods, the things that matter most, your name, your values, your peace, are always earned, never inherited. I was 28 when I met Noah. We were both attending a finance seminar in Napa Valley, surrounded by professionals dressed in muted tones, sipping black coffee and jotting down notes, like the next big idea was just a sentence away. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone. Honestly, I was only there because my mother insisted it would refresh my network. Noah stood out, not because he was flashy or loud, but because he wasn't. He had this calm way of carrying himself, the kind that made you feel like he wasn't trying to impress anyone. When we were paired for a workshop exercise on asset diversification, he didn't bat an eye when I mentioned managing a few family-owned properties. He listened without judgment, without that spark of curiosity that usually followed any mention of my background. Over lunch, we talked about books instead of bonds. He told me he used to work in community development, helping small towns plan affordable housing. His eyes lit up when he described the time he convinced a mayor to turn an abandoned shopping complex into a public library. It felt real. He felt real. Within months, we were inseparable. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, more like a steady flame that kept growing. He made me laugh on bad days, respected my independence, and never once made me feel like I had to shrink myself. I thought maybe this is it. Maybe this is what it feels like to be truly seen. We got married quietly at Lake Tahoe, just the two of us, a justice of the peace, and the sound of pine trees swaying in the background. No massive guest list. No gold-embossed invitations. Just simplicity. That was how we both said we wanted it. A few weeks after the wedding, I took him to the estate. The place I had grown up. I hadn't shown it to him earlier. Not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted him to know me first, not the price tag wrapped around my childhood. He stood in the grand foyer, looking up at the stained glass dome my father designed, his mouth slightly open. I watched him take slow steps through each hallway, run his fingers along the banister, and pause at the library where my mother still kept her finance books lined up like trophies. "It's breathtaking," he whispered, almost to himself. I smiled. "It's just home." He didn't say much that day, but something changed after that visit. Slowly, his questions started creeping in. "Who owns the property now?" "Just you." "Is there a trust? Like, what happens to the estate if something happens to you? Do you have a whole setup already?" I told myself he was just being practical. After all, we both had finance backgrounds. Maybe he was just thinking ahead. Still, something felt off. The way he asked, too careful, like every word was rehearsed. The way he lingered in my father's old study, running his hand over the desk as though imagining himself behind it. One evening, while we were having dinner on the patio, wine glasses half full and candles flickering between us, he brought it up again. "You know," he said, casually slicing into his grilled chicken, "it might be smart for us to put both our names on the title. Just in case. For tax purposes and stuff." I put my fork down. My parents built this house. Every stone. Every wall. It's not just an asset. He nodded, then smiled like he understood. But the next week he asked again, this time suggesting a joint trust, for simplicity. That was when the alarm bells finally rang too loud to ignore. It wasn't about the house. It was about what the house meant. It was about how his eyes had changed, from wonder to calculation. About how his tone, once soft and curious, now felt like strategy wrapped in affection. One night, I found him in the study going through an old drawer of documents. He said he was just looking for property records because he wanted to help sort things. That was the night I said no. Clearly. Firmly. "Noah, you're my husband. But this estate, this home, remains in my name. It's not up for negotiation." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, thin, almost polite. "Of course. Just trying to help." But I saw the flicker in his eyes. That brief flash of disappointment. He tried to blink away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Somewhere between trust and doubt, I realized love can't survive where intentions are unclear. And no matter how charming someone seems at the start, time always reveals what they're after. And now, I had to start asking myself a painful question. Had Noah ever truly loved me, or was he simply playing the long game with the prettiest prize he'd ever seen? When my father was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, my entire world tilted on its axis. I left my consultancy work immediately. Clients could wait, contracts could be paused, but time with him couldn't. He had months, maybe weeks, and I wasn't going to waste a second of it. I practically moved into the estate, the home he had built with such purpose. I spent my days helping him through treatments, holding his hand when the pain grew sharp, and listening to stories I'd heard 100 times before. He was thinner now, quieter, but his presence was still that of a giant. Every evening, I sat beside him on the veranda where he used to sketch designs, and I soaked up every word. Noah, on the other hand, didn't take the shift well. At first, he said all the right things, offered support, brought food. But the warmth faded quickly. He started calling less, texting more. When he did show up, he looked uncomfortable, impatient, like a man who had wandered into the wrong room. "You've been gone for weeks," he said one night, barely masking the frustration. "We're supposed to be building a life, not camping out in your past." "My father is dying," I said quietly. "And I'm your husband," he replied, his voice sharp. "But you don't seem to remember that." I didn't have the energy to argue. I was too busy praying for a few more mornings with the man who had shaped my soul. 2 months later, my father passed in his sleep, peacefully, just as the sun rose, with my hand in his and the morning birds outside the window. The will had been prepared long before. He left the estate entirely to me, not just because I was his only child, but because he trusted I'd protect what he built. I didn't care about the legal details, I just wanted him back. Noah, however, suddenly cared a lot. He started asking again, this time more directly, about putting his name on the deed. He said things like, "It's just a formality, and we're married. It should be joint anyway." I reminded him of our earlier conversations. I told him again no. Then the pressure began. One afternoon, I came home from the notary's office to find a stack of papers laid out neatly on the dining table. They looked official, title documents, signatures, and seals. My heart sank as I flipped through them. According to these, Noah had somehow already transferred half the ownership of the property to himself. I stared at him, numb. "What is this?" He didn't even flinch. "It's cleaner this way. If you just sign the final page, we can avoid the legal mess." I knew then he'd been planning this long before my father passed. I made a few calls, ran the documents through a friend who worked in real estate law. Turns out, they were fraudulent. Every seal, every notary stamp, fake. Worse, there was a money trail. Noah had wired $360,000 to someone posing as a legal consultant, trying to buy legitimacy behind my back. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just stood there in the study, the one where my father's sketches still hung on the wall, and I felt everything crumble inside me. That night, I packed a bag and drove to a hotel. I didn't even tell Noah I was leaving. I needed space to think, to breathe, to survive the betrayal without falling apart. The next morning, I filed for divorce. My attorney moved fast. We froze all financial activity, cut off access to shared accounts, and launched a full investigation into the fraud attempt. I filed for a restraining order the same week. When Noah tried to call, I didn't answer. When he showed up at the estate gates, I watched through the security cameras and told the guard not to let him in. He sent emails, some apologetic, others furious. He tried to twist the narrative, claiming I was paranoid, that I was making up his intentions. But I had the bank records, the messages, the forged documents. Truth didn't need defending, it stood on its own. I had always believed in quiet dignity. But now, I learned that sometimes dignity comes with filing papers, blocking numbers, and refusing to let grief be used as leverage. The man I thought I married had never existed. He was an idea wrapped in charm, powered by ambition, and fueled by entitlement. And I would never let someone like that own even a single inch of my father's dream. I moved back into the house with my mother the week the divorce papers were finalized. The gates that once felt like a fortress now opened to something else entirely. Peace. Not the loud kind that came with triumph or revenge, but the gentle kind that wrapped around you when you finally stopped running. The estate had aged in the quiet. Ivy crept a little farther across the stone walls, and the rose bushes needed tending. But the bones were still strong. My father had built them that way, sturdy, timeless, just like he'd built us. My mother and I didn't speak much at first. Grief has its language, one that speaks in soft nods and lingering hugs. We spent our mornings walking the garden paths he once mapped out in pencil sketches, pausing by the bench where he used to sip coffee and listen to the birds. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of memories. One morning, while I was arranging freshly cut hydrangeas for the hallway vase, my mother stood beside me and said, almost offhand, "We should share this place. Let people feel what we felt here." That one sentence shifted everything. We started with small ideas. A weekend yoga retreat. a quiet space for grieving families to gather and light candles in memory of those they'd lost. Then came inquiries for intimate weddings, renewal ceremonies, and anniversary dinners. Within months, we transformed the grand halls and gardens into something new, an event venue built on elegance, emotion, and healing. We named it the Brooks Estate in honor of my father, not just to carry his name, but to keep his spirit alive in a place that now offered comfort and celebration in equal measure. It wasn't about grandeur. We focused on intention. Each event was carefully curated, floral arches shaped by hand, soft candlelight illuminating cobbled paths, music played on the same old piano my father bought me when I was 9. That piano became the heartbeat of every gathering. Whether it was soft jazz for an anniversary couple or a gentle lullaby during a baby naming ceremony, it played the melody of new beginnings. I found myself again in the small rituals. Every morning started with a walk through the hanging garden, the sun peeking over the hills just as it used to when I rode my bike down the gravel driveway. I'd stop to trim the wisteria, make notes in my journal, and pick the day's centerpiece flowers. On some afternoons, I sat by the piano and played the same piece over and over, Debussy's Clair de Lune. My fingers stumbled at first, but the notes eventually came back like an old friend. Evenings were often spent with my mother on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets and in conversation. We talked about everything and nothing. She told me stories from her college days that I'd never heard before. I shared things I'd buried too deep when I was trying too hard to keep everything together. We healed together, not through grand gestures, but through showing up. Through working side by side, laughing when the catering stove broke mid-rehearsal dinner, and crying when we saw an elderly couple dance under the chandeliers for their 50th anniversary. The estate transformed with us. We restored the East Wing into guest suites for overnight stays. We planted wildflowers along the outer fields and turned my father's old studio into a quiet reading room where guests could write letters to loved ones or reflect in silence. People who came here didn't just rent a space, they entered a story. A home once born from love, shaken by loss, and rebuilt with care. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole, not because everything was perfect, but because I had chosen to keep going. To take the pain, the betrayal, the silence, and turn it into something beautiful. The Brooks Estate became more than a name. It became a sanctuary. And as I walked through its halls each day, touched the wood banisters my father carved, listened to my mother hum as she arranged flowers in the foyer, I knew we had rebuilt something stronger than what had been broken. We had created a new legacy, one rooted in grace, in growth, and in the kind of love that doesn't need to be proven, only felt. The sky was a soft, pale blue the morning of the memorial. A breeze drifted through the tall oak trees bordering the back lawn of the estate, rustling the white fabric we'd draped over the pergola. My mother and I had spent the day before arranging chairs in curved rows, choosing photos, lighting lanterns along the paths. It wasn't just a goodbye for my father, it was a tribute to everything he stood for. Guests arrived in silence, some with hands clasped tightly, others wiping away quiet tears. Friends, students, and former clients. People who had walked through homes and buildings he designed, who had watched their lives unfold in the spaces he imagined. I stood at the center of it all, holding a copy of a letter he'd written to me years ago, one I hadn't been able to read until the night before. Just before the ceremony began, I saw him.
Noah.
He stood beyond the gate in a press suit, face drawn, holding something small and dark in his hand. Maybe a folded letter, maybe nothing at all.
He didn't call out.
He just stood there, waiting. I nodded to the security guard. "He's not welcome," I said softly. "Please ask him to leave." There was no rage in my voice. No bitterness left. Just resolve. As the gate closed behind him, I turned back toward the pergola. The light caught on the glass urn at the front, and for the first time in months, I felt completely still. That night, I sat in my father's old study and finally read the letter he'd given me on my 25th birthday, the one I'd always kept tucked away in the back of my desk drawer. "My dearest Lila, you will learn with time that not all who walk beside you are meant to stay. Some will love you for your light. Others will try to bottle it. You cannot control which one they are, but you can choose who you let in. Your worth is not measured by how long someone stays. It's measured by how deeply you stay true to yourself when they leave. You were never meant to be easy to understand. You were meant to be real and kind and impossible to replace. And no matter what anyone takes from you, remember, you are always whole. Love, Dad. I cried that night, but not from grief. From gratitude. Gratitude for the clarity, for the peace, for the quiet wisdom that had been there all along, waiting for me to grow into it. Months passed. The Brooks estate bloomed with new life. We hosted weddings beneath the wisteria, anniversary dinners in the old sunroom, and poetry readings in the garden. Each event added a new chapter to our legacy, turning sorrow into sanctuary. Then one day, his name appeared in my inbox.
Noah.
The subject line was simple. Thank you anyway. I opened it, heart steady. He wrote that he'd lost almost everything: money, friends, the career he tried to shortcut through charm. He said that working with ex-offenders in a halfway house had taught him more about humility than any boardroom ever had. That he was learning, slowly, to rebuild from nothing. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Just wanted to know he finally understood. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry. I wasn't. I simply had nothing left to give him. Not my time, not my energy, not even my words. And that, I realized, was the final step in healing, not closure through confrontation, but closure through peace. I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone. One Saturday afternoon, I stood by the garden path as a wedding party arrived. Nervous smiles, whispered promises, laughter bouncing off the ivy-covered walls. The bride clutched her father's arm as they approached the altar. I recognized that look in her eyes, the weight of love, of memory, of everything about to begin. The piano began to play. I placed a hand on the back of a nearby bench, the wood still warm from the sun, and smiled. Not just for them, but for all of us, for the people still searching, for the ones learning to let go, and for those of us who finally understood that we didn't have to be loud to be strong. The Brooks estate stood tall behind me, filled with echoes of laughter, of healing, of new beginnings. And in that moment I knew my father's legacy was safe. And so was mine.